Today, we're going to talk about that management layer of your accounting department. What do they do? What they don't do? And what do those roles actually look like? Let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about the accounting manager and senior accountants within an accounting department. Last week, we talked about the controllers, and you can click the link up above if you want to see more about that role. I said in that controller video that the controller is the one that is supervising staff, and that is absolutely true. But this accounting manager or senior accountant level can also supervise staff as well. So you have the controller who's likely supervising accounting managers and senior accountants. Then you'll have those senior accountants and accounting manager who will then supervise staff accountants and other clerk positions. Depending on how big your department is, there can be multiple layers of management. But in a department that has multiple layers, these staff members will end up managing those lower level staff. Past supervising employees, they validate checklists during close. Again, they're not doing the transactions most of the time, but they're validating the work, checking the work of other people. They're doing the more complex work that is required within the department as well. If you have accruals that are happening, if you have other complex entries, if you have debt payments and things, recording of assets, and just other things that require special attention, these supervisory level or advanced level staff are the ones that are likely handling the majority of that work. Within a small business, it's rare that you'll have a CFO, controller, accounting manager, senior accountants, and clerk. It's not until you get much bigger that you need all of those particular layers. But it's often the case that you may have that controller or CFO, and then you may have kind of that senior accountant level below them, and then you have a couple clerks below that. And then ultimately, they handle communication between leadership, and that can include controller, but also CFO, also external parties from that department. There's a lot of things that once they've gotten to this level in their career, they can be interfacing or working with much larger portion of your total team. So now that we understand what they don't do, can also offer some clarity as well. They're not setting the company-wide strategy. That is the CFO that's typically a few levels above them. They are often involved in those discussions. They're helping with budgets. They're providing data for forecasts. They're validating data for those upper management. But again, they're not the one that's setting the strategy. They're not fully responsible for the accuracy of the reporting. That is what the controller is doing. But at this leadership level, they're likely getting that experience and exposure to reporting, which means that someday they can go be that controller. So they maybe own portions of it. They may have an initial review part of it, but they're going to be involved in that process some way, somehow, but they're not the ultimate person that is responsible. And then they're not the entry level clerk. They're not doing the transactions. They're the bridge between the clerk, they're the secondary review, and then the bridge up to that controller. And so we want to be clear. They are not the clerk. They're not doing the majority of the transactions, but they can do transaction work. Often in small businesses, you'll see that the senior accountant is doing some initial transaction work that the controller is then reviewing. So you may have a clerk level that is doing some of AR, AP, deposits, all that sort of stuff. You may have this senior accountant that is doing a little bit more advanced stuff, but still involved in some of that data entry, review of that data entry. And then the controller or CFO is over that whole department. But as you get bigger, they move out of that data entry portion of that job. So you can have a little bit of both, but know that as you grow, that senior accountant is not going to be on that day-to-day data entry portion of the job. These layers ensure leadership can actually lead instead of getting buried in the transactions. The goal of the accounting manager and the senior accountant is to make sure that transaction questions don't bog down the leaders and take up all of their time. If they do, that means the leader is getting paid way too much for that job, because if they're focusing 50% or more of their job, or even 20% of their job on the transaction level work, they're not doing the things that they're getting paid the big bucks for. So we want to keep the controller and CFO protected from that transaction level work, from the details of the decisions of how stuff gets booked. Maybe the controller is the final sign off, but the controller should not be the one that is worried about that day in and day out. These management roles are really important as you scale, because they're the glue between the leadership and the staff. If you don't have this role, the leadership is now required to manage that staff. And when they're having to manage that lower level staff, they're dealing with lower level issues, which goes back to what I was saying. They're getting paid too much to do those things. So we want to be clear. These roles are probably not needed in the early stages. You may hire a senior accountant before you hire a controller or CFO. In essence, in my first CFO gig, when I was initially hired, I was a glorified senior accountant. I was still doing some transaction work. I was doing the financial work. I was doing the strategy work. And as the business grew, I grew up through those roles to where I became a true CFO. And as I did that, I hired the people beneath me to make sure that I was insulated from more of that day-to-day work. Again, this is messy in small to medium businesses. So know that there's going to be crossover. Know that the roles are not always going to be the same. But with a little bit of focus, with a little bit of planning, you can build these layers in a way that you're optimizing the time of every person in that layer. So let me know, what do you think? What did I miss with an accounting manager or senior accountant? I want to hear from you in the comments. Any questions, any feedback? I appreciate you for listening and hope you like and subscribe. We'll talk to you next time about the operational staff.